Despite international efforts to mediate conflict and implement peace agreements, 90% of civil wars occur in countries already affected by conflict, and 50% of all peace agreements fail within 5 years. In the face of statistics like these, international actors are in constant need of innovative approaches to conflict mediation. But in today's peace negotiations, half of the population is almost entirely unrepresented. Despite 7 Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security, on average, women are only 9% of delegates to peace talks and just 2% of mediators in peace processes. What effect does their absence have on the peace process itself and on the sustainability of the peace that follows? Countries affected by conflict risk falling into a cycle of violence, agreement, and relapse. International actors risk supporting processes that will quickly collapse, losing their investment of resources and personnel, and people lose the prospect of a stable and peaceful society. But quantitative research on peace agreements tells us that this story could be different. A peace agreement is 64% less likely to fail when it includes civil society. Women and civil society inclusion goes beyond resolutions, rights, and norms. It's about operational effectiveness, namely improving security and building a lasting, quality peace. Peace processes and the agreements they produce provide key opportunities to transform institutions and set the direction for post-conflict reconstruction, affecting the future of society. Peace talks that include only warring groups tend to focus on power, territory, and the state. But research shows that when women are at the table, they often raise key economic and social issues and advocate for a more equitable peace. This helps to identify and address common drivers of conflict and fragility and turn toward issues like education, health, and justice in post-conflict planning. An inclusive peace process also reduces the likelihood that excluded parties will act out and undermine the process, and generates greater buy-in, as women and civil society leaders can appeal to their communities for support. Peace processes have many variables and occur in hugely different contexts, but to date, one constant is the almost systematic exclusion of women. This begs the question, if not women, if not civil society, who is at the peace table? How are peace talks designed, and what is the criteria for getting a seat? In most peace talks today, those who carried weapons are granted a seat, as the conflict parties become the negotiating groups. But before the 1990s, it was the non-state armed actors who were largely excluded from peace talks. Then a rise in civil wars led to the acceptance of these rebel groups as legitimate parties at the negotiating table. Today, it's the non-state unarmed actors, women and civil society, who are the excluded groups. But their inclusion may be the next paradigm shift as empirical evidence of their positive impact continues to grow. So why is it so hard to make the participation of women in civil society a reality, despite all the rhetoric around women, peace, and security? A number of particular obstacles arise when it comes to peace processes, with power dynamics as a first and underlying hurdle. Conflict parties who come to the table do not want to dilute their power, and mediators feel that they'll be wasting political capital if they insist on a more inclusive process. But this is ultimately short-sighted, since we know that inclusion brings greater legitimacy and a more robust peace. A second obstacle to building an inclusive peace process is time and the urgency of ending violence. But many high-level mediators stress that peacemaking requires strategic patience. The UN Special Advisor on Yemen, Jamal Ben-Omar, purposely slowed down the negotiations in Yemen to ensure a more detailed outcome document with a long-term map of the transition. And during this deliberative time, Ben-Omar repeatedly raised the idea of a 30% quota for women in the National Dialogue Conference to a table of all-male negotiating teams tasked with setting the terms. He stressed that the process could only be successful with women represented, and that the quota was not being imposed by his team or the UN, but requested by the women and civil society groups who were central to the revolution. A third barrier to women's participation is the perception that so-called women's issues are not relevant at the security-focused negotiating table. In reality, of course, what are sometimes dismissed as women's issues, such as sexual violence and conflict, affect entire communities and play a key role in conflict dynamics. And women constantly raise a variety of short-term and long-term security issues for consideration in negotiations. For example, a delegation of Syrian women developed concrete, creative suggestions for implementing ceasefires for the Geneva peace talks earlier this year, even though they weren't admitted to the official process. Many argue that women don't need to be included in the negotiations because they can be included later in the peace process, in the implementation stage, for example. But their insights may be most crucial when the agenda is being set. This is an important point when it comes to sequencing and designing peace processes. But even when the peace negotiations and agreement are completed without women at the table, mediators can increase women's participation in innovative ways throughout the implementation phase, as we've seen in the Great Lakes region with the launch of the Great Lakes Women's Platform. Finally, many mediators argue that they need to remain impartial to do their jobs, and this is true in political terms. They can't favor one side over the other, but that doesn't mean that they don't bring a set of values to the table. As we know, the international framework for women's participation in peacemaking is now quite robust. Resolution 1325, which is binding on all UN member states, recognize women as critical participants in peacemaking. Nearly 15 years later, the Security Council has passed 6 more resolutions to underscore this agenda. So mediators are now expected to implement these international norms and uphold these objectives in their work, and to do so in a way that positively engages local norms and cultures. In fact, unique to the chief mediator's position is the opportunity to implement firsthand the promises of Resolution 1325 at every stage of the peace process that they design and oversee. And there are many ways that mediators can facilitate an inclusive process. We have examples of official consultative forums accompanying peace negotiations in Guatemala and the Philippines. We have models for direct representation of women and civil society groups in Northern Ireland, Somalia, and elsewhere. In fact, in the latest negotiations in the Philippines earlier this year, we witnessed a historic first. A female chief negotiator signed a major peace agreement that ended a decades-long conflict. Women made up half of the government's negotiating team and 1/4 of the total number of signatories. Of course, no model will ever be perfect, and every context is different. While there are obstacles to inclusivity, these are some of the lessons and emerging models that could help build a more lasting, quality peace. From the dinner table to the boardroom table, women's participation in decision-making is increasing in societies around the world, and there is mounting evidence that the benefits outweigh the risks at the peace table, and that a more inclusive process helps maximize the chances for sustainable peace. In other words, it's time to reset the peace table.